Hi, everybody. Hi. Okay, we're going to get started. And we're going to make a brief presentation, and then we're going to put you all to work. So we're going to take out some flip charts and some Post-its and talk measurement and indicators and fun things like that. Okay. So I'm Susanna Campbell. I am a professor, Provost Associate Professor at the School of International Service and one of the co-PIs of TRAC, the Translating Research into Action Center, funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation. We are just about to enter our second year. So it's super exciting. And what we're talking about today is how we can think about measuring and increasing societal impact, and how we've been thinking about that in TRAC, and how we can think about that from both a kind of broader metrics perspective and a research design perspective. So we're going to go through things pretty quickly so we can workshop. We go? Yep. So we can, this is way too much on one slide, but I wanted to get the kind of full definition out there. So one challenge of kind of TRAC and the work that we're doing is people are like, well, what is research translation? What counts and what doesn't? And why do we care about it? And one thing that we realized is that health, education, climate science, sociology, political science, all of these different disciplines have different names for similar things. And so this is part of the work that we're doing is running through that. For the purpose of our center and how we're thinking about it, let me just give a couple definitions. So the way that NSF defines it, the National Science Foundation, is that research translation is a process of advancing discoveries made while conducting academic research into tangible solutions that benefit the public. This could shape research processes, such as answering decision makers' questions, or the communication of findings, such as collaboration on problem solving using existing evidence. Not super clear, but shows that there's a range of things. The way that we're breaking it down is that you can research translation either means like you've done the research and now you're translating it, and there are multiple ways of translating it, or it can be much more of a research practice partnership or a research policy partnership, like the one that Danielle Soldani and her collaborator, Eric, whose last name I can't remember, Mr. Bethel, exactly, that they have, right? So it can be something where you identify the research question and the process of doing research and the whole thing in partnership with the end user, or you do your work and then you disseminate it. So, and it's really important to think about the broad spectrum, because the goal of what we're doing is trying to kind of take a big tent approach to what AU is doing so that everybody can see themselves in this space if they want to see themselves in this space. The end users that we are, a lot of the way that the scholarship on research use and translation is broken up is really in terms of end users. So the way that we're thinking about it is that the end users can be policymakers at multiple levels of government, non-governmental actors, community association, private companies, or others who kind of use their research, or who benefit from scholarly research in some kind of directly engaged way. So TRAC's focus is on expanding AU's capacity to do this. In reality, what we're doing is trying to first actually capture AU's capacity to do this, because what's super clear is that we have a lot of faculty, staff, and students who are already deeply engaged in this work. So understanding what we're doing and actually making that visible is a really important piece of it. And thinking about measurement and monitoring what we're doing is really important, because if we capture the inputs into this, the time and energy that it takes, then we give more value to the outputs of it. So this is part of what we're going to talk about, and I'm going to pass the mic over to
So with that basic definition of research translation in mind, we really envision a spectrum of research translation activities, and we're going to talk about then some ways to measure these different types of activities, from very low engagement, and this is where I will have more to say, to very high engagement, which is where Susanna will have more to say. I'm going to get my arm out of the way so you can take pictures. But starting with the very lowest level of engagement is really what researchers are already probably doing, which is engaging in research and making their findings public or available in some way to some group of people, usually in scholarly outlets. The next step up would be taking those research findings and expanding the audience for that research. So publishing them in more popular outlets. And we'll talk on the next slide about some more concrete examples about some of these. A little higher engagement would be something like a presentation where you get more of an interactive component rather than me doing a unidirectional information push out to outlets. And then moving up in more high engagement is where we start to get into that co-created or applied research. Actually, this is the co-created research, right? But these are different kinds of partnerships where you are working with other people to either apply or co-create in some sort of partnership. And then very high engagement is where you're more fully immersed in some external role. And with that in mind, again, multiple potential end users, very similar to the last slide. And of course, recognizing that these are going to sometimes be overlapping audiences. So people who are practitioners can also be members of the general public. Policymakers could also be at a private company or an NGO, etc. And just to acknowledge, this is a version of, for those who are at the plenary, this spectrum of engagement that was presented earlier that we are adapting for our own purposes. So two different types of translated research that I find helpful to break down are ones where you have an actual tangible output. And that's what's on this left column, where you're creating something new, right? News articles, you're creating blog posts, infographics, policy memos, videos, presentations, or forums with the community. So you have a new product that's out there. However, sometimes research translation is not necessarily taking your research and then remaking it into a new product, but it's really taking you as a research expert and applying your expertise in different scenarios. So on this right-hand side, you can see that interviews, serving on boards, giving testimony, that's really the application of your expertise rather than the application of your research outputs. These are all different forms of research translation. The reason why this is important is because it does somewhat change how we might start to track and measure these types of engagement. So I'm going to start with the low end of the spectrum, and my role in TRAC is open access as a very easy and passive form of research translation. I like to think of it as just dipping your toe in the water. I want to reach a broader audience, but I don't necessarily have the expertise to engage in this, or I don't have the time. I don't have the incentives, right? This is very common, I believe, at AU. Open access is one thing that you can do to expand the potential audience of your research without really having to do extra steps of creating new research outputs or engaging as an applied expert. So there is research, plenty of research, that making your publications open access do benefit diverse audiences beyond academia, including journalists are aware of open access, are more likely to be citing and using open access research in their news stories. Policy papers are more likely to be citing open access for the very simple reason that they can access it, right? If you put it behind a paywall, the people who can access things behind a paywall are libraries, well-funded institutions, not necessarily policymakers and journalists, as well as practitioners, general public, right? Really anyone who doesn't have great institutional access loses the ability to access your research unless it's open access. And you also tend to get not only more citations, woohoo, but they tend to be more diverse. So they come from more fields, they're more geographically diverse as well. So lots of benefits in terms of reaching and getting citations. And it does not necessarily need to cost you money to make your research open access. There are a couple of different ways around this, and I'll talk a bit about it. One is that the library has a fund, and this is actually linked to more information about that fund. If you're publishing in a fully open journal, we'll support that. You can publish anywhere, and you can often make a version of your research openly available, even if the published version is behind a paywall. So what that is something called accepted manuscript. So it's the last version of your research before the final published version. So it's like a Word document that's gone through peer review and been accepted before the journal adds their style editing, the page numbers, that kind of thing. That can be uploaded a number of places, and publishers are okay with this. They have restrictions on when and how you can upload them. There's a wonderful resource called the Open Policy Finder that will tell you for every journal what those restrictions are, but every single journal allows some form of this. Yay! So we have an institutional repository, Aura, which is a great place to host these accepted manuscript materials. We also happen to have a librarian who will upload them for you. I can't do it for everyone on campus, but because you guys are here and interested, for anyone who has accepted manuscripts, just email me and I can help make sure. I actually got an email yesterday from someone. It was 8 accepted manuscripts and their citations with DOIs. That's exactly how to do it. I can do the work from there. And what that does is I can post your accepted manuscript with the same DOI so that when they're citing your research, it's the same research. You don't get 2 separate sets of citations. Okay, so you have the paywalled version of record, you have the accessible accepted manuscript that people can access and cite. Yes. How are publishers okay with this? I love this question. One, open access is a much larger initiative. About 50% of research is being made open access. There are countrywide mandates. Our own government right now is finalizing procedures for government-funded research to be made open access. So there's a lot of pressure already on publishers to find ways to make research open access. Also, at the end of the day, we are the consumers. We do have power, and sometimes it feels like pressure. I have to publish in this journal. I have no say in it. Most publishers actually are more willing to work with authors than it may feel like when you're getting that accept or deny decision from a journal. They also get a lot of revenue from those fees that the library supports. So they're seeing this as one of their new revenue models to pay for the version of record. The other fact, you own the copyright to your work before you sign over the rights. There's only so much that they can do to really take full ownership. And I think they realize that it's better to work with you rather than risk a full-scale revolt and rejection of the publication system. So I think those are some of the reasons. That said, really depends on the publisher how much and how willing they are and what those restrictions look like. Just to give you a very quick example, this is a book chapter. In this case, this professor emailed the publisher and just got permission to put the accepted version up. This was about a month ago, less than a month, and you can see it's already got views and downloads. Woohoo! That she wouldn't have had otherwise. So when it comes to measuring impact, there's really a wide range of measures that can be used to demonstrate how your research is making a difference in the world in some way. Usually citation counts are what we are most comfortable with and what academia is used to using. But what we're about is really the other end of the spectrum, right? How are we changing the world? That is really more butterflies' wings than it is data. So some thoughts is that there are analytics like those views and downloads that we just talked about that can be gathered and presented as evidence of impact. That said, we're never going to get the true measure, right? We can't reach inside people's brains to see how research forms their thoughts, their behaviors, their ideas, right? So we just have to kind of rely on what we can access and try and build that into the research process. I find it really helpful to focus on your research goals and use that to inform measurable outcomes. And Susanna will talk a bit more about that to facilitate high engagement forms of research impact. But essentially, what are your audiences, right? That's why we talked about that pretty early. And what kind of success can I gather that shows me how we're reaching those audiences? One more thing before I turn it over to Susanna. Altmetrics is another form of data that we can collect. Again, this is kind of on the low end of like we see that something is happening. We can't necessarily determine causality, but we can use it to make some guesses about who might be engaging with the work. Altmetrics is a form of tracking research that has a DOI, or a digital object identifier. It's a unique number that's assigned to research outputs, most commonly journal articles, some books. You put it in our repository, it gets a DOI so we can track it. But it's data that tells a story. So here is an example. And I know this is very tiny, so I'll just read it for you. This is something that was published by an SPA faculty member in 2016. And this is a summary of all of the attention this publication has gotten. So keep in mind, this is not a translated research output. This is just a journal article. It's been mentioned in 153 news outlets, 9 blogs, 8 policy sources, and then we have social media use as well. This isn't the full spectrum. There are other colors that are not represented by his research, but this is what altmetrics looks like in practice. So all of these numbers tell me a story about who is interacting and who some of those audiences are. With that, I'll turn it over.
Okay, so what Rachel has gone over is, one way of thinking about how we can measure the impact of our work is first capturing the use of the research outputs itself. And I think that really thinking about altmetric, thinking about open access, it's like a necessary condition for anything else, because if people can't access it, how's it going to have an impact? What we're working on in TRAC, and this is some work that we're leading with the National Science Foundation and trying to train the other grantees about how to do this, is that if we're actually going to measure the societal impact of this work and of these efforts to build institutional capacity, right, to build university capacity to alter the way that they engage with the environments around them, then we need to have a kind of much more complicated picture of impact. And we need to slice into the type of impact that we really want to capture. So basically what TRAC is trying to do and what NSF is trying to do is strengthen the capacity of institutions of higher education to translate research. Then the idea is that if you have stronger capacity, then you're going to have the uptake of these translated research outputs as products, policies, or practice. And it's going to be some kind of change in the way that external actors outside of the academy actually use the research output. And if they use them in a different way, then the theory is that you have a kind of increased societal impact. So whatever policy, product, or practice is informed by the research will therefore have a different impact on society than it otherwise would have. Anybody who does research design here? Can I see a show of hands in some ways? Right? So this is like really complicated. Like you can't design a single study to capture this. And so part of what we're working on with TRAC and part of the tools that we're developing is that you need to think about this causal chain, each of the links in this causal chain, going from measuring changes in capacity to support faculty, staff engagement outside of the university, to changes in measures to reward engagement, such as tenure and promotion guidelines, to measuring the relevance of research to external actors. So you can push research all you want, but if it's not actually relevant to people outside, they are not going to buy it. So really understanding what is the kind of back and forth bidirectional pathway between the researchers and these external actors. You need to measure the initial intake and uptake of the research as something that's integrated into at least thinking, right? So are they kind of using it? Then you need to say, well, does that use lead to a change in behavior? So is there kind of sustained uptake and some broader change in behavior? Then does that change in behavior actually lead to a change in outcome on the ground? And in terms of research design methods and how you think about metrics, as you get closer to this side, than large quasi-experimental designs, large media men, or deep case studies, or even randomized controlled trial can be how you would really have to think about impact. But as a university, if we are thinking about this side, that we really want to kind of strengthen our capacity to measure, or our capacity for staff and faculty and students to engage externally, then do we want to only measure the impact of individual projects? Because if we have to do RCTs or quasi-experimental designs or deep participatory designs for every single project, then that's a hugely heavy lift that we have to carry as a university. And so we also need to think about part of what we might want to measure and capture is the relevance of our research to external actors as an initial metric, right? Is it relevant? Is it actually meeting need? Is there some kind of engagement? And so really thinking critically about what is the thing that you want to capture when you're thinking about increased universities' capacity to engage external, and in my role as a faculty member in actually making a broader impact. Do I want to hold my success based on whether the State Department implements a policy or practice? Not necessarily, because I may have done a really good job at engaging in that partnership, but there are just other constraints that prevent them from using it. And so we need to think in a more nuanced way when we're trying to actually measure the impact of our engagement efforts and not hold ourselves accountable only for a change in policy or practice, but think about how we're actually measuring these kind of more intermediary outcomes. And that should feed into tenure and promotion processes. And another really important piece here, and then I'll open it up, is that if we don't think about measuring our engagement, how many meetings did I have to have with the State Department even to design this project? So I just ran a survey within state about their data and evidence use. Like, huge access, really fascinating. It took me a year of meetings to do that. So if we capture our engagement, if we're actually measuring the process of doing this, then we can better reward it. Then we can better learn from which type of engagement is more or less effective. Then we can better incentivize it. It's like in our tenure and promotion files, we might think of, I did 2 years of field work in order to publish this book. Well, it took me a year of meetings in order to come up with this partnership. So we need to begin to think about how what we're measuring and how what we count can actually help us understand and value this type of engagement and make it count kind of in our stories that we tell, in our tenure and promotion, and also in what we learn about what works and what doesn't. So we can go into any of this in detail. We have a group exercise that we want to do. We have one more slide. But I want to open it up for questions. We've kind of talked about two slightly disparate things, and see if you want any explanation on anything. Yes. You mean promotion and tenure processes? Yeah. Yeah. So the kind of ethics of it. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a really good question. I think that This is an ethical issue, right? So one way of thinking about it, and we've talked about this before, is that in terms of the use of human subjects in research, the Belmont report kind of regulates this. And one thing that Belmont report talks about is that you have to have an equal distribution of benefits and harms. And our IRB process focuses on the distribution of harms. So if the research is actually doing harm, is that actually equally distributed? I mean, that's kind of what the ethical guidelines ask. What we don't ask is, what are the benefits? What value are you giving back? And how is that distributed? And so at this point, I think there's a risk for universities or any kind of broader research institution creating an incentive that says, or a requirement that everybody has to have a broader impact or societal impact, because not everybody should. Not everybody wants to. If you're studying rebel groups and rebel movements and how they can be more effective, should you go and talk to rebel groups and rebel movements about making themselves more effective? I mean, that depends on who you're talking about, right? But I think that we need to kind of set this as a set of options and requirements and things that people should think about, rather than some requirements that people should think about, rather than trying to say that everybody has to have a societal impact, because not everybody should, not everybody wants to. And I think that's the kind of future of this. But when you are engaging, you do need to think about, what are the benefits and harms of what I'm doing. Rhea. Yeah.
It's like
Here. Yeah.
the single phosphorus is and one that they actually say they want it short to that like it's and the changes that this is kind of the person but it's like TV
Right. That's it.
and said yes he did
Right. Right.
Right.
Right. Right. Right.
They tried to you
I mean,
said
yeah. I mean, I think that and then I'll pass it to you, Rachel. I mean, that's the basic theory behind the lab that I run, and the basic theory behind any kind of, research practice or research policy partnership, or any engagement where you kind of start inductively and you're like, I want to understand what policymakers think before I even develop my question, right? So I think that from a metrics perspective, and also thinking about incentive systems, I think that helping people to understand how to measure the relevance and how to capture the work that goes into making it relevant is something that we should really think about, right? And saying, like, you may not want to do that. That may not be appropriate for everybody. That may certainly not be appropriate for a lot of assistant professors, right? But if you're doing it, let's count it. And let's count it first as something other than service. Like in my tenure file, I had an enormous service section that included all of this stuff. I'm like, that's not service. That's what it took for me to actually do my research. But right now we're counting it in a particular way. And so really kind of developing measures and ways that people can count this, that we can talk about it, that we can talk about the progression of it, I think would really help to innovate in this space. It would help our P&T process, but it would also help us learn like what research tends to be, what are the conditions that lead to more greater relevance? Is that with particular levels of engagement, particular types of actors, particular types of research? I mean, there's so much that we can also learn in that space, which I think is really important, but also valuing the time that it takes to do it.
And also, are you repeating passing down?
That's it.
Wait, see, down to see us bottom up. It's like cannot take that seat to go to key. The community that says to be the another factor. You know that you there about hanging like they actually do want to bring and you lied when I divided out they saw the subject same thing it's started to they bad it is they can't off it.
Yeah.
See yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
They sense
Yeah. That's it. Well, I think we have a real opportunity, and maybe Priya and Rachel, you can say something about this, to change this at AU. I also think that we as kind of scholars in the space need to not say like, you know, my research changed UN policy, United Nations policy, or my research changed the way that this community behaved, because no, it didn't. It contributed, it facilitated, right? It was not it's not the only thing. And the more that we acknowledge that any change is done in concert with others, right? And the degree to which you are able to contribute to change is based on the relevance of what you're doing in the first place, right? So if it fits what people are trying to do inside an institution and the opportunities that they see, then it's likely to feed into it. You're not going to force it. So it's also the way that we talk about impact is really important.
so
Yeah.
that they the feedback was yeah.
Yeah, if you think about something like experiential learning, that's something that we value at AU. That's a perfect example of that feedback loop where we're working with community partners. They're learning for us. We're learning from them. That has not historically been in the research endeavor, right? That's more of a teaching side thing. When it comes to measuring your research impact, we have really historically focused on how cited is your research and how prominent are the publications where you're publishing. And that's about it. The most recent round of our tenure and promotion updates, we did ask every department to consider societal impact. So there actually is some new language in department and unit guidance. But what that looks like, and I've looked at about half of them, is really variable and I would say entry level, where most of them will say, and we also value this kinds of research. But it doesn't say, and we recognize that developing these partnerships, that doing co-created research, while it has a more, useful end product to those impacted audiences, is much more difficult, takes longer, may not result in high-level publications. You may not be highly cited for this work, but it matters in a different kind of way. We are not, as far as I can tell from most guidelines, not seeing that level of detail at this point. So I think, and to be honest, we are trendsetters nationally to even have that language in guidelines. There are some institutions, and they're usually the ones with service learning as a major component within their institution, where they're recognizing that the scholarship of community-based learning and service learning needs to be incorporated into research and not just learning. They're the ones that are really more ahead of us, but we are one of the first universities to try and do this at a university-wide level. But you can see we've still got work to do, right? We review the tenure and promotion guidelines every 5 years. We just did it a year ago. Now what we're doing, and Priya, I'm hoping you'll talk more about this, is trying to engage with more people about what that actually means in practice. Because when it comes to evaluation, people tend to revert back to what they know and are comfortable with, which tend to be metrics rather than narrative stories of impact. And really, if we want to start pushing this to the right and changing our culture at AU, there has to be some acceptance that you may be doing really impactful work that looks entirely different than how we have described successful research impact in the past. Priya.
You might get the clocks now.
Okay.
To make sure people can hear. Yeah, so not really, but I feel like a talk show host. I had one question, and then I was just going to comment a little bit. So as I'm looking at this too, I'm really thinking about the mission of the institution, right? And you were talking about service learning based institutions, but AU has a very strong focus and actually a very clear advantage in experiential learning and now civic engagement, which is a big part of President Alger's focus. So my question is, how do we kind of make this linkage between institutional mission and the way that we think about faculty trajectory, right? Because that should be core, right? And one of the problems with the way that tenure, promotion, reappointment is set up is that you have these buckets which are supposed to be distinct when in fact they're actually overlapping. So, you have your teaching, you have your research, and then you have your service. And if you're term faculty, it's currency, which is supposed to encapsulate research if you do it, right? So 2 points. One is that some of this stuff seems like currency in the field, which is not necessarily traditional research, right? But that's not accounted for in tenure track and tenured files. So that's one thing that sort of strikes me. And then the second thing that strikes me is that that division seems very artificial. And there has to be a way that we think about making that less distinct and more fluid as an idea. So anyway, those are just some of the things. This is great food for thought. So thank you for these graphics too.
I don't see those changes happening overnight. I think discussions like these are how we become more comfortable embracing new forms of scholarship, new forms of engaged service, right? With combining these different things. There are other university examples where they are starting to play with some of this, of having more narrative or values-based approaches to how we get evaluated rather than these 3 buckets and having your metrics that either do or don't fit some person's criteria that are set in their mind, regardless of what's in the guidelines. But really, it needs culture change is the big thing that I think you and I and everyone in this room should see as their joint charge. Because we can write all of the things that we want to and say, this is what we value, this is what our mission is, right? This is how we enact our values. But when it comes time to evaluation, if people revert back to what they know and understand, impact factor, right, we're not going to make good progress. We're going to deny tenure to people who are doing really good research, but don't fit some older definition of what it means to be impactful. So I think the more we have these conversations in our departments at, during presentations like this, I think Priya is leading a work stream for promotion leadership, and that's part of what we have planned in the next year or two. So start talking with people who are serving in evaluation roles about some of these concepts. And the more that happens, the more it becomes known, understood, not scary, right? That we are here to embrace different types of impact, different types of research, and that's okay. That's what should happen at a university.
Yeah, it's a good place, guys. Well, it has, and it did it. Which why it got here with another thing, and then that did it very good. And that's the thing I no, you think And often, the idea that and after that is done. Very easy. So, yeah. Come.
Well, we were originally going to do a breakout activity where we started brainstorming different ways to measure impact to different audiences, but we are very short on time. So I think it might be worth just skipping to the summary that when it comes to these kinds of measurements, it can be messy. It's difficult. It's not as straightforward, right? And there is no one size fits all solution. As Priya was saying, disciplines are going to have different ways to think about how to best represent this kind of work in their evaluations. But we as TRAC think that both research outputs, translated research outputs, and engagements as an expert all have a role to play when we're really thinking about breaking outside of academic walls and reaching our communities, our practitioners, right? These external audiences that we want to impact, to engage with, to change minds. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, the work that I lead at TRAC is on research on these things, right? So I'm viewing all of this as a research problem, which is fun because we like research problems. But it also means that if anybody in this room is interested in talking about this, working on it, this is part of what we're doing. What we're trying to think about is what are kind of measures or indicators and data collection strategies at each link in this chain. And what do we want to kind of capture ourselves as a way of building a case for how and what you measure and why, and how we can think about our impact. Because the more that we actually study this, then the more evidence we can bring to bear in any kind of discussion about what works and what doesn't, how we improve the capacity that we're building, how we improve the work that we're doing, how we improve how we're measuring it, how we're thinking about it. So the more that we treat this as something that we're trying to understand and use ourselves as a bit of a case study, right, then I think the more we can advance and support what is already cutting edge efforts from AU in this area. So please talk to me if you're interested. Thanks for sitting through our measurement discussion. I know everybody loves to talk about measurement. Sorry.
We do.
I know. Yeah, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.